7 through 14 of that text. Last week we talked about Paul's two-pronged approach to evangelism. In the two-pronged approach to evangelism, we saw that there were those who were gifted evangelists. It could be individuals who are gifted and are called to the profession of evangelism, the Billy Graham, some pastors, many pastors as well, but also individuals who are in the laity or the congregation of the church, and those individuals may have a spiritual gift of evangelism as well, and they have just a sense of boldness in being able to share with individuals. They have no problem walking up to somebody cold turkey and just using the opportunity that the Lord involves or offers at that moment. The rest of us are not necessarily with that gift. As a matter of fact, most are not with that gift, but we are all called to witness. And we talked about what that would look like because we are called to live questionable lives. We're called to live lives that are intriguing to those who are not believers, so that it might evoke curiosity about our faith and it might draw them. We talked about 3 ways that we could be a blessing to others, and we were challenged last week to bless at least 3 individuals over the course of this last week as we were leading up into today. And so there were 3 different ways we talked about as examples that you could be a blessing to others. Does anybody remember what one of those was? Gifts. Sharing gifts. Just unexpected gifts. What was the second one? Acts of kindness. Exactly right. And the easiest one to do was words of affirmation. Man, you guys get an A. That is awesome. Good job. All right. So this week, we're going to look at a distinctly biblical practice that we could do as an act of blessing or a work of blessing to others. Now, before we do that, I want everybody looking up here, otherwise you'll have an inclination to cheat. I want to ask you this question. The Bible talks about the Son of Man came for different reasons. So in Mark chapter 10, verse 45, you fill in the blank here. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. Exactly right. And to give his life as a ransom for many. In Luke chapter 19, verse 10, the Bible tells us that the Son of Man came to seek and save who? The lost. Very good. You beacon, I saw that. English teacher cheater. The Son of Man, thirdly, in Luke chapter 7, the Son of Man also came eating and drinking. Sarah didn't even balk. She just looked. Yeah. He came eating and drinking. I want to suggest to you, if you spend a little time looking in the Bible, you will find it amazing how much of Jesus' ministry was done at a table. Eating and drinking with others. As a matter of fact, Jesus himself said the Son of Man came eating and drinking. He pointed it out. That was part of his ministry plan. And he says, and you're calling me a drunkard and a glutton. Because they said he seemed like every time he turned around, that's where he was at. Because he used it as ministry, eating and drinking. Some interesting things can happen sometimes at churches that have fellowship times. And a lot of churches have gone to having a fellowship time between Sunday school and worship, or having fellowship time after the worship service, and then they'll have coffee and things. And there's a story about one particular pastor who, in this particular church, they would have a little fellowship time afterwards, and they would serve coffee as well as donuts and some other things. And but they talked about how good their coffee was and made a big deal out of it. When Gene and I visited a church here a few weeks ago when we were on vacation, it was one of the things we noticed. They had a nice coffee bar, and people were kind of around it, milling around, and they're talking and visiting with one another and introducing themselves to one another. We were quite fascinated with that and enjoyed the coffee ourselves. The story in this one particular case, though, was a pastor came up to this little boy, and he said to him, he says, do you know why we offer coffee after church? The boy thought for a moment. He says, well, I suppose it's to keep the people awake so they can drive home. Which says something about the message. So I'll be watching you all here this morning. Luke chapter 14 is where I want us to look at, if we could, this morning. As we're looking at that, I'm just going to highlight just a couple of things here very quickly. Notice there in verse 1 of chapter 14, it says, "Now it happened, as Jesus went into the house of one of the rulers of the Pharisees to eat on the Sabbath, they watched him closely." And then we go on there farther. In verse 7 and 8, we see here the conversation starts to happen. And Jesus starts using wedding feasts. And he's showing an equivalency to the wedding feast and the kingdom of God. But he's also talking about their relationship with one another and others. And he talks about, if you find yourself seated in a place of honor, you presume yourself there, you might get booted from that spot. And he's talking about everybody needs to respond with humility. And he works his way through that conversation. And he says in verse 11, "Whoever exalts himself will be abased. He who humbles himself will be exalted." But then he goes into verse 12. He says, "When you give a dinner or a supper," again using a meal as an example here, he says, "Do not ask your friends to dinner. Do not ask your brothers. Don't ask your relatives. Don't even ask your rich neighbors, because they'll invite you back and you'll be repaid. Rather, when you give a feast, invite the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you shall be repaid at the resurrection of the just." Eating and drinking. One of the most powerful tools that you have available to you to be a ministry of blessing to others, especially those outside the church. You see, the first two passages we talked about, the Son of Man came to serve, and the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. That's what Jesus came to achieve. But the last verse there in Luke chapter 7, when it says he came eating and drinking, is telling us how he sought to accomplish the task. He did it around tables. I want to challenge you and me to start using our table more and more as an opportunity to reach others for Christ. One thing about the medicine I take is it makes you thirsty. So let's see how we can shape our mission in a neighborhood with the table. First off, the first point there is the table can be a surprising place. It can be a surprising place. The most surprising things about Jesus was who he ate with. Now, his detractors, as we noted there, oftentimes would accuse him of being a drunkard and a glutton. Jesus obviously was neither of those things. He obviously would use the preparedness to eat and drink with sinners, tax collectors, and prostitutes as opportunities to be a witness or to build relationships and to reach the lost. The enemies, of course, wanted to use it as ammunition against him. Think about how he started his public ministry, though. He started his public ministry at a wedding feast, providing wine at the wedding feast. He took and made a surprising ministry out of this table of the wedding feast. He took the water jars, which were used for the purpose of ceremonial washing. If you showed up as a Jew and you felt that you had been ceremonially contaminated, maybe because you encountered a Gentile someplace, then you would come in and you would ceremonially wash at these jars of water in preparation of coming into the wedding. And so Jesus takes these symbols of separation, which was the ceremonial jars of water, the ceremonial separation there between Jews and Gentiles, and Jesus turned it into that which was a symbol of hospitality, a symbol of inclusion, and a symbol of fellowship. He took the water, which was of one purpose, and he turned it into a whole new purpose that brought people together, not demonstrated that they were pulled apart. Then he continued to demonstrate that kind of purpose and mission throughout the rest of his ministry. Jesus used the table to surprise his fellow guests. over and over again. Luke's gospel does an incredible job of pointing that out, maybe better than any of the other gospel writers. It's at the table that Jesus accepted the worship of a sinful woman and then criticizes the self-righteousness of Simon the Pharisee in Luke chapter 7. It was in Luke chapter 14 that we saw here that Jesus dispensed advice about welcoming the poor into our lives, the ones who are struggling and impoverished. And in Luke chapter 24, we've seen it here recently, that we saw that it was at a table that Jesus revealed himself to the two who were on the road to Emmaus. I want to challenge you, beloved, this morning. I want to urge you, I implore you, use your table to break down the walls that separate people in our communities. Surprise the world around you by the people that you invite to your home. Change your way of thinking. Better stated, let the Spirit of God change your way of thinking. In his book, Surprise the World, Michael Frost says, and we're looking at this in our Wednesday night studies, we are called to be radical socializers. It's kind of an awesome thought when you think about it. How can you socialize in such a way that it becomes radical? Well, in the book Right Here, Right Now, Alan Hirsch and Lance Ford, they say this, and I'll quote them. They said, sharing meals together on a regular basis is one of the most sacred practices that we can engage in as believers. Missional hospitality is a tremendous opportunity to extend the kingdom of God to unbelievers. If every Christian household regularly invited a stranger or a poor person into their home for a meal once a week, we could literally change the world merely by eating. See, the table can be a surprising place where people start asking questions about your faith. God breaks down those doors. When you invite the unexpected starts showing up. Secondly, the table also fosters community or relationship building opportunities. Have you ever seen an older couple at a restaurant and then be in complete silence? When it happens, it's so odd looking because this couple, they don't typically have their technology in their face, and so they're busy, they're talking about different things. And so if you see them just staring at each other, you're wondering, what's wrong? Now, everybody else, you look at the place, they're all sitting there going, and they're not looking at each other. The waitress comes and, and we've even gotten to the point where you don't even need the waitress anymore. You can just text her what you want in your menu in half the restaurants anymore. That's what we've come to. But see, the table is a great opportunity because it's a table that can be a forum for conversation and hospitality. It's a place for rest and reconciliation. I want to suggest something to you. Consider this. Listen to me. Instead of inviting somebody to church next week, invite them to dinner. Instead. Not both. Instead. Invite somebody who doesn't know the Lord. Invite them for lunch. Meet them for breakfast. Invite them over for dinner.